Over the past 5 years, I've transformed and built gardens from the ground up using Korean natural farming practices. And while I love Korean natural farming, it can get a bit confusing, especially if you've only heard bits and pieces. So in this video, I'm going to clarify and send you in the right direction wherever you're at in your gardening journey, but especially if you're just getting started or if you want to get restarted on a better footing. I'm going to be walking you through the basics of KNF, the way that I've come to understand how it works and the major mental shifts that gardeners need to make when coming off of growing with a more conventional approach. And this is going to be a very practical video, so after watching, you'll have a pretty helpful understanding of where you need to start and where you personally want to take your gardening practice. I'll be walking through the various recipes, each of which will sort of scale in difficulty, but I also want to make this as approachable as possible. So if you're the type of person who likes to have recipes in physical or digital form, you can get access to my entire gardening resources library by hitting the link in the description or scanning the code on the screen. All of the recipes and more are in there for you to download and print out for free. And by the way, if you're new here, I'm Taylor. Welcome back to the channel. I help gardeners explore sustainable and regenerative growing techniques without a lot of the waste and cost of a lot of modern gardening practices. And Korean natural farming, or KNF, as I'll refer to it for the rest of this video, is one of the most useful but often misunderstood frameworks for alternative agriculture. But to start, I think a lot of people might be asking, what exactly is the problem? Like, why do we need to change the way that I'm gardening? Or why do I need to make all these fancy inputs? And I've got a couple responses to those questions, which, by the way, I think are totally valid. There are so many people out there telling you how to do just about everything, and certainly how to garden. And so I wouldn't want you to hear that KNF is some path forward that is just going to break down every wall, make everything 100% easier, and everything will just work out from here on out and you can just get it perfectly right. There's no cure-all for garden ailments. And on top of that, what I tell everyone who asks me if they should try KNF is, hey, if things are working for you, why change it? There's really no need to overcomplicate things for yourself, especially if you're a casual gardener. KNF is for people who like experimenting and like DIYing, and for people who maybe are experiencing some legitimate challenges in their gardens or other growing operations like orchards or food forests or livestock. And that said, on a big picture, I would say, and I frequently say on this channel, that on the whole, I think it's time that we truly re-examine our growing practices and start to question the practices that were handed down to us. And I'm hardly the only person saying this. There are so many incredible thought leaders doing important work here. The fact is, a lot of modern gardening mirrors modern conventional farming, and many of those practices are what I consider to be unsustainable and degenerative. Now, those words kind of get thrown out around a lot, but to simply define them, unsustainable practices refer to growing techniques that have an expiration date, right? There are only a set number of resources that can be used, and so at a certain point we'll run out and have to find something else to use up. An example of this would be the way that many conventional or synthetic fertilizers are made. There's a large amount of energy spent to make them, and the raw materials used to make them are mined in such a way that disrupts or damages the environment and depletes mineral deposits quickly. This is an overly simplified explanation, but you probably get the gist. Then we've got this word degenerative, which basically means where in the way that a piece of land is farmed, the soil is left off worse year over year from where it started. Things like repeated mechanical tillage and herbicide usage are examples of this, where the soil structure and the biology in the soil is consistently set back, leading to greater compaction, loss of topsoil, and loss of viable growing space over time. Many of these unsustainable and degenerative practices have invaded home gardens and farms because there are systems built up and designed to supply growers with these particular tools. But where I believe the problem lies is not actually in the tools, the practices, or even the systems, but in the mindsets. Many of us have a compromised perspective when it comes to growing plants and raising animals, and that perspective is that we are the end. And when our survival and enjoyment is the end, it becomes infinitely easier to justify or even just ignore the means by which we get there. And so the primary mental shift that needs to happen, I believe, when it comes to viewing our growing practices is that we stop thinking that we're the recipients of our produce and start realizing that we're the stewards of the growing process. And I know that probably sounds wishy-washy, but we'll tackle it a little bit more later on and make it tangible. For now, it's time to look at how KNF responds to our conventional growing practices and where it might lead us toward the necessary changes. Korean natural farming, KNF, is a way of growing that definitively prioritizes the micro and macro biology of a growing space. And this is far from the only framework that seeks to do this. But over time, the goal of KNF is to restore your garden to a nature-like state with the production and abundance and self-sustaining qualities of nature. Rather than repeatedly remineralizing the soil year after year, we're setting the biology up in the soil to remineralize itself. That doesn't mean that we're gonna get a garden to a place where it's fully hands-off ever. We just come in and harvest, but we're actually able to take less and less of an interventional approach and more of a collaborative stewardship role alongside the process at work. And yeah, I know this sounds like Fantasyland utopia. Hang in there because we're gonna get practical really soon. First, let me just give you an overview of how this is actually accomplished in KNF. On paper, KNF relies on homemade gardening inputs, most of which come in liquid form and are applied to the soil and to plants at various stages within the growing season. And the purpose of these inputs is to mimic processes that can be observed in the natural world and then apply them in such a way that keeps plants healthy, protected from disease, pests, and growing and producing the right parts of themselves at the right time. Using these inputs, we're able to gently stimulate plant defense responses. We can nudge plant hormones. We can supply trace minerals at key times that signal in the plants to start utilizing those minerals. And perhaps most importantly, we can furnish the microbial environment that the plants are growing in such that all of these processes and more happen more easily. We're gonna walk through a roadmap of what I consider right now to be the easiest starting places for home growers to begin their KNF journey. And so as you follow along, it's possible that you've made some of these before. Maybe some of them you've heard of, but by the end of this walkthrough, you should have a pretty good understanding how these work and where you might want to get exploring. For the sake of not getting too in the weeds for this video and keeping it a manageable length, I'll only provide brief explanations of each of these processes for making the recipes. But just a reminder, if you do wish to make any of these, you can check out our free resource library. And if you'd like to support our work on this channel and have an even more thorough understanding and a kind of a tangible reference manual, you can check out my new book, A Home Gardener's Guide to Korean Natural Farming. Now, the first input that I want to point out is actually not even part of the suite of KNF core inputs. It comes from the neighboring Korean framework called JADAM organic farming that is very useful for getting started. And so consider this a step 0. If you have never made any garden input before in your life and you want a super simple stepping stone in, you can make this JADAM liquid fertilizer. Now, I don't mean to diminish this fertilizer's value by saying that it's simple. There's a lot of goodness to be taken from this input. Basically, what we're doing is decomposing plant debris and thereby extracting some of its vital nutrients so that we can reapply this to our soil. 3 ingredients for this recipe: plant debris, water, and leaf mold soil. Now, the leaf mold soil is the special ingredient, and this is what makes this concoction so valuable. When leaves decay, they create a really rich humus that is full of microbial life. And those microbes are going to go to work on the plant debris that is submerged in the water. Don't overthink this too much if you're just starting out. Fill up a bucket or a jar with plant debris, add a handful of leaf mold soil, and cover the bucket with water, and then just let it rot away. It's gonna stink because the plant debris is putrefying, but once a few weeks or months have passed, or years even, this stuff really doesn't go bad. You can strain out the solids and water it into your garden. And now is as good a time as any to mention that with all of our inputs, we always want to be diluting these in water before applying them to our plants. The goal for our inputs is not so that we can load up the soil with nutrients. The goal is actually sending signals to our plants and the microbial communities in the soil. So a little goes a long way. Of course, this will supply nutrients, but not in the same way that a synthetic fertilizer like Miracle-Gro might if you have used that in the past. The next input on my list for beginners is one that is often confused for JADAM liquid fertilizer actually, but it's really not the same thing or a replacement for each other. It's called fermented plant juice, and it's actually a slightly simpler set of ingredients. But the process for making it is a bit more precise, which is why it comes after JADAM liquid fertilizer in my mind. Fermented plant juice is made by extracting minerals, hormones, enzymes, and microbes from plant debris via a process called osmotic pressure. And this is a key process to understand because it'll come up several more times. It's not as complex as it sounds. Basically, we're chopping up plant debris, mixing it with a high quality sugar, and allowing the sugar to draw moisture out of the plant cells. And this creates a syrupy liquid that preserves the compounds contained in the water from the plant debris. And once the liquid has been extracted, usually over a 5 to 7 day span, the plant debris is strained out and you've got your fermented plant juice. Now, this is a beginner's guide, so we're not going to talk through all the ins and outs of every input and how it can be used, because there are so many ways that you can use all of these inputs, much of which is what we devote time in other videos on this channel to. But if you're thinking about making fermented plant juice for the upcoming growing season, pick the first strong plants that spring out of the ground in the spring and harvest them early in the morning so that you get the max moisture content out of them. And then apply your fermented plant juice in the early part of the growing season. Once your plants start producing their buds or their fruit, if they're fruiting plants, you can go ahead and stop applying fermented plant juice because its primary purpose has reached its end. Fermented plant juice provides growth hormones and enzymes that stimulate a lot of vegetative growth. So the leafy green foliage the young plants beef themselves out with so they can photosynthesize a ton and grow big. That's what the fermented plant juice is going to help them produce. Spraying it on your young plants is going to signal to them, now is the time to beef out. And for fermented plant juice, we always apply it diluted 1 to 500 in water. I'll try to remember to say the dilution rates for each of the inputs, but you can also use the resources as reference. Inputs number 2 and 3 are water-soluble calcium sources that are going to hit a different set of needs that our plants have. And to make these, we only really need 3 ingredients: vinegar, eggshells, and animal bones. And this gets a bit nuanced, and I sometimes will just combine these all to make one all-purpose mineral extract, but for this video, we'll talk through each of them separately. Very simply, we're making these by extracting minerals from the materials with vinegar. And this happens all on its own. And you just got to prepare your materials. For the eggshells, bake them to clear that film and any residual egg white. And for the bones, you got to roast them a bit to open up the pores. And I like to make this extract with the bones after I've already extracted the collagen in my homemade bone broth. And then both of these, we're just mixing 1 part eggshells or animal bones to 10 parts vinegar and letting it sit for 2 weeks. And then we can strain out our eggshells or bones and we've got our minerals. Bones are going to result in what we call calcium phosphate because they contain a bit of phosphorus that is going to aid our plants as they form their flowers. And then eggshells are just going to yield a slightly stronger dose of just straight up calcium. We call this calcium acetate. And both of these, as I said before, are water-soluble nutrients. So they're in a form that is immediately plant available. They can soak up the minerals through their foliage, through their roots, and these are going to provide a key signal to our plants to start mobilizing calcium through their bodies so that they can form structurally sound fruit, not to mention structurally sound plant bodies. We don't want spindly stems and branches. So there are 2nd and 3rd KNF inputs. And by the way, these are both shelf stable pretty much indefinitely, meaning that you can keep them at room temperature out of direct sunlight, sealed up, and they should keep. We'll cover one more input and then we'll take a knee and talk about what we can actually do with these. The last one is actually oftentimes what ends up being people's first introduction to KNF, from what I can tell. It's lactic acid bacteria serum, sometimes just referred to as lactic acid bacteria or LAB. And this is an interesting one because lactic acid bacteria is one of the most common bacteria in the world. It shows up everywhere. It's also the driving bacteria that cultures some of the most popular foods in the world, like yogurt and cheese and kimchi, pickles, bread, cultured meats, and much more. And so for making this serum, I'll show you the traditional KNF recipe, but I will also say that if you have yogurt, or better yet, you make your own yogurt, you can likely use the whey from that if you just strain it off a little bit. And you can use kefir whey too if you make kefir, and it's likely going to result in something similar or maybe even better than what we make here. That said, this is a great way of making LAB. Check out our full video tutorials if you want to go a bit more in depth. But essentially, we're going to collect starchy water from a starchy grain like rice by mixing water with the grain and straining out the cloudy water. And the starch water ferments for a few days on the counter until it starts smelling a little tangy, and then it's used to culture milk. And this process is similar to cheese making. In fact, you can use the curds that float to the surface of the solution to make cheese. But for the LAB serum, we're looking for the whey, which is the yellow greenish liquid. And this solution contains a variety of strains of lactic acid bacteria that are what we use as an all-purpose plant defense spray. Defense specifically from disease like powdery mildew and rust or whatever your plants are facing. And this is not the strongest microbial input that we'll make in KNF, but it is a really versatile. And when we apply this with our other inputs, it acts as a really nice collaborator. And these microorganisms in the LAB are going to acidify the environment that they get sprayed on, which means that the environment becomes less hospitable to pathogens and disruptive microbes, and more hospitable to the beneficial processes that help the plant uptake nutrients and utilize the nutrients and grow their bodies and function the way they're supposed to. And that's what this is really all about, is just nudging the plants that we grow in the direction that they already know how to go and want to go. We're just taking a more active role in facilitating those functions. And I know that I said LAB was going to be the last entry level input in this section, but One really quick addition, if you make the water-soluble calcium inputs, you already have it, it's just straight up vinegar. As I mentioned before, a high quality one preferably, and vinegar is just going to sort of fill out the yin to the LAB's yang, and I apologize if I offended anyone with that. Vinegar is sometimes called the cleanser in KNF lingo, whereas lactic acid bacteria contains healthy communities of lactic acid bacteria. Raw vinegar contains healthy communities of acetic acid bacteria, which is just another side of the protection game. It's also going to stimulate a mild plant defense response when applied, which is good because we want the plants to be able to defend themselves from pests and disease, and it's going to be more resilient. And so both LAB and vinegar, just like our other inputs so far, are applied at a dilution rate of 1 to 500 in dechlorinated water. And to preserve it, you can just keep it in the fridge for up to a year, or add brown sugar in equal parts by weight mixed up to keep it shelf stable at room temperature. Let's take a break right here and look at what you've got. If you've made these inputs and you've got plants in the ground, you could go ahead and start applying fermented plant juice, lactic acid bacteria, and vinegar once a week by spraying or using a watering can to cover your plants, and you're gonna get some great results. Fermented plant juice is stimulating that early growth. It's cueing the growth hormones and the enzymes to spring to action. It's providing small amounts of trace minerals depending on what plant you use to extract the plant juice from, and it's all helping your plants put on their above ground leafy biomass that they need before they can start growing their fruit. The LAB and the vinegar are keeping the microbial environment on lockdown, helping to draw out plant defense chemicals from within the plant, and it's even signaling to the plant to communicate with the soil biology a bit. We won't go too far into it here, but the plants and soil microbes exist in a beautiful collaboration. They feed and protect each other, and so part of what happens when a plant thrives above ground is that the microbes thrive below ground, which is what we're all about when it comes to sustainable and regenerative growing. Once your plant, say you're growing tomatoes, a determinate variety, once the tomato plant starts gearing up to flower, you can see the buds kind of forming. It's time to switch out the fermented plant juice and bring in the calcium phosphate. And same goes if you're growing apples or other fruit trees or shrubs. That calcium phosphate is critical for the plants to develop firm, structurally sound, and healthy fruit. As things transition into the actual flower production, bring in the calcium acetate. All the while, we're still applying LAB and vinegar and keeping our plants healthy and strong. Guys, if you're just starting out with KNF, that's probably where you'll want to start for this coming growing season. We'll talk through some more of the things that we can continue to work with or work on into the growing season, but all of these are things that you can make right now and within a matter of a week or two. Of course, if you live in a very cold climate, you'll have to wait till spring to harvest your plants for your fermented plant juice. But the plants that you use for that will be popping out of the ground before your last frost date. So you'll have time to make it before getting your plants into the ground. And every once in a while, someone asks me a question like, is fermented plant juice a replacement for my all-purpose store-bought fertilizer? And I always say, no, not really. And the reason for that is one that I've spent a lot of time discussing in other videos, but to put it succinctly here and to tie it back to what I said earlier, we've got different goals for growing when we're practicing KNF. Remember that mindset shift that needs to happen. With conventional growing approaches, the whole mindset is all of this is for me. And what comes from that mindset is that we treat our soil as just a holding space for nutrients so that we can force our plants to eat those nutrients and then grow us food. Instead, what we're doing here is we're coaxing the soil biology and the plants to collaborate as nature intended. The below ground microorganisms are being nourished, the plants are being fed and protected, and then in the right time, we get to harvest as part of the natural cycle of growing. And so do I think that KNF has the potential to boost yields? Of course, absolutely, which is why I make that claim regularly. However, what I'm telling you guys, because I think that you'll understand this, is that we actually want to be taking a holistic view of this stuff. We're boosting yields, yes, but we're also boosting the soil biology. We're boosting the environment for the local pollinators. We're boosting our microclimate, the microenvironment that we have been given to manage and steward well. So yes, we're benefiting from the abundance that's generated when these natural processes are tapped into, but the plants themselves, the biology in the soil, the perennials, wildlife is all benefiting alongside us. Not saying that we're growing our food and flowers so that a deer can come and munch them, but growing in this way is a much more sustainable and regenerative way that leaves the soil better than where we found it. Now I want to make sure to wrap up this point though. If you're used to applying chemical fertilizers, you cannot expect to just cycle out those fertilizers and cycle in these inputs, because whenever plants grow, they're taking nutrients from the soil and using those nutrients to produce their biomass. And so in this style of growing, we need to be replenishing our soil with organic material in some form. Could be leaves, compost, manure, grass clippings, crop residue, something, so that the biology in the soil has something to break down into bioavailable nutrients. The calcium inputs that we went over are water-soluble forms of nutrients, but organic matter contains insoluble forms of nutrients. Good news, because it means that they won't wash away, but they take time for the microorganisms to break them down into water-soluble nutrients that can be taken up by plant roots. This is why I'm such a fan of organic mulches. No need to till these into the soil, but if you can supply your soil with a steady stream of organic material, compost is king, in my opinion, and many other people's, then these inputs are really going to do their best work. Okay, so we've covered the first 5 inputs from KNF plus a bonus input that I think are pretty reasonable for every gardener to make. I also understand if those feel like too much to make. Some folks just like to buy things or have other people make their inputs, and that's totally all right. There are many ways to garden sustainably and regeneratively. But if you're ready to upgrade and get into the second tier of Korean natural farming inputs, that's what this section of the video will cover. Again, use the resources that I've provided as references. Check out my book if you like what we've covered so far, and check out our other videos on this channel if you want to dive deeper into any of the recipes, because this video is meant to help you get started and kind of know what you're looking at on a big picture level. Of the remaining 4 inputs, we're going to be exploring 2 of them that are really not too complicated to make. And in fact, one of them is something that some of you might be able to just collect, and that input is seawater. For the rest of us who don't live near a sea, we've got salt water, and the way to make that is just by adding a high quality, broad mineral spectrum, non-iodized sea salt to dechlorinated water in a ratio of 1 to 30. 1 part salt, 30 parts water by weight. And that's the replacement if you're unable to collect your own seawater. Now, salt is one of those things that I've noticed is deeply triggering to many gardeners. In fact, there is a good chance one of you watching this right now is actively pulling up the comments section to inform everyone that I am a heretic for telling you to use salt in your garden. But here is the thing, and I say this every time, but that's because I've learned that I have to say it every time. We're not applying nearly enough salt to harm our biology in the soil. Anything that you apply to the soil in large amounts will cause harm. You may have noticed a theme in this video when it comes to applying our inputs, which is dilution. And the same goes for our sea salt water. Whenever you apply seawater or salt water to your garden beds or include it in a plant spray, you always dilute it 1 part seawater to 30 parts dechlorinated water. And this provides just the right amount of salt for healthy microbial cultures to establish and for pathogens to diminish. It's a very small amount. And if you are still skeptical, don't worry about it. If you'd rather not risk it, no problem. I have been applying salt in every garden that I've started in very small amounts, and I've noticed that no harm has ever been done to the soil by doing so, because it's the equivalent of a few granules per square foot each application. So that's that. The second input in this category is one that I consider to be a sort of companion to our fermented plant juice, and it's called fermented fish amino acids. Fermented plant juice, you might remember, is chopped up plant debris mixed with sugar. Moisture gets drawn out of the plant debris and is collected. With fermented fish amino acids, it's a similar thing. We're drawing the moisture out, but we're also further decomposing the fish waste by letting it ferment for 6 months to a year. You can collect some of the fermented fish amino acids earlier, but to get the full spectrum of beneficial amino acids and enzymes from the fish, we want to let it decompose for a good long while. And this can be applied alongside our fermented plant juice as an additional boost for our plants. This stuff is more similar to an actual fertilizer because it contains a lot of nutrients, and it's referred to in KNF as sometimes as the gasoline, because it really helps get plants to get up and go. Next up, we've got another longer term project. This is our Oriental herbal nutrient, and we need to come out with an updated version of this recipe in video form. We do have an older video that details the process in more specifics. Essentially, what we're getting here is a plant medicine that is made out of 5 different herbs, often used in traditional Asian medicine. We got cinnamon bark, angelica root, licorice root, ginger, and garlic. And these herbs are fermented before undergoing a 2.5 month long extraction process, where we basically are making a tincture out of the ingredients, collecting the extract, and then combining to make Oriental herbal nutrient, or OHN. And I never want to put people off from making this, but because this is a video for beginners, if you're just starting out, please don't be intimidated by this input. Learn the others first and then tackle OHN when you're ready. Some KNF practitioners might scold me for that, but that's my opinion. Now, the last input that we'll take a look at is actually the keystone input of KNF, and it's Indigenous Microorganisms, or IMO. And if you've looked into KNF much before this, you've probably undoubtedly heard about it. IMO is where we capture, culture, and apply the strongest, most well-adapted microorganisms found in the soil in our given environment. And that process of capturing and culturing them is the primary one that I use right now because I really appreciate it for a number of reasons. This is a huge topic. You can read my free ebook, A Beginner's Guide to IMO, found in the resource library to learn more. You can check out our other videos on this process. But for getting started, I actually want to highlight a sort of adjacent technique that comes from JADAM organic farming. The first input that we looked at, the liquid fertilizer, is actually a similar sort of process, although it differs slightly. This way of culturing indigenous microorganisms is called JADAM microbial solution. And believe it or not, we have plenty of videos on this topic as well. But to keep it simple, using the same leaf mold soil that you collected to make JADAM liquid fertilizer, we can brew up a batch of liquid microbes by feeding them a starch like cooked potato or cooked and blended whole grains. And to do that, you just mash up your carbohydrate in water, add a big pinch of sea salt. Sorry to those of you who can't bring yourself to do that. This is essential for this recipe. And then put it in a bucket of water with your leaf mold soil. Wait a couple days until you see a foam disc appear on the surface of the water, and then water it into your plants, diluted 1 to 10 or so. This is a great way to get started with IMO. It kind of gives you an easy entry point into using IMO in your garden, so I highly recommend trying it this season if you haven't ever done so before. As said before, we have other videos that walk through the whole process of IMO using the KNF techniques. We'll be showcasing a method of culturing them in the winter, so stay tuned for that in the upcoming months. But JADAM microbial solution is where I got started with indigenous microbes. I highly recommend it to everyone who is getting into this way of gardening. And I'll wrap up this section by summarizing what you kind of get out of these additions and how to use them. So for the seawater, typically this is used as a twice a year sort of application, once in the spring and then once in the fall, and more frequently if you've got seriously mineral depleted soil. Seawater and high quality sea salt contains so many essential and trace minerals and really goes a long way toward feeding soil biology. So it's a good way of remineralizing your soil naturally. Fermented fish amino acids, like I mentioned before, is something to be used alongside your fermented plant juice as a kickstarter for your plants. You want to dilute it 1 to 1,000 to start and then mess around to kind of see, but it's pretty potent stuff, so take it easy. It's got a broad spectrum of plant available nutrients, and as always, we just want to be careful in the way that we feed our plants and feed our soil because you can throw things out of whack if you overfeed. Oriental herbal nutrient is in one way the missing link to the plant health immune support system that we're giving our plants with our lactic acid bacteria and our vinegar. Because it's an alcohol-based solution, it enters the cell walls of the plant differently, and it interacts uniquely with pathogens, disrupts their metabolisms, and it is also used as a mild pest deterrent and is used in pretty much all of the other KNF recipes. And then we've got our indigenous microorganisms, in this case in the form of JADAM microbial solution. But if you're ready to take it to the next level, you can go the whole way capturing them from a forest with a grain medium, growing them out on another food source, and slowly integrating them with your local garden soil. IMO is going to help in so many ways. It's supplying plants and soil with uniquely adapted microorganisms that thrive and have survived in your exact climate for hopefully a very long time. You want to collect these from undisturbed forests, ideally undisturbed for a very long time. And as you apply these over the years, you're likely going to see a substantial improvement in your soil as the microbes work their magic. Microbes help chelate minerals, they defend plant root zones, they decompose organic matter, they help to create natural tilth. And when we use indigenous microorganisms to do this, they're, in theory, the ones that have been adapted to do so specifically for your general climate. And there's a lot of cool potential for IMO in your garden. So now that we've taken a look at these inputs, there are a few last things that I want to touch on for beginners. I think it's important, first of all, to manage expectations. A lot of people like making huge, bold claims about their exact system or framework being the best one that is going to work no matter what. And if it doesn't work for you, it's only because you didn't do it right. And I just want to dispel that now. Obviously, I wouldn't devote so much space on this channel to these techniques if I didn't really think that there was something special here. But of course, these are not an immediate panacea to every garden problem. You can't expect overnight change with something like gardening, in my opinion. And if someone is promising to show you a way that you can make overnight change, I'd suspect that things could crumble just as quickly. The point with a lot of this stuff is actually to learn from the processes and to make observations and long-term investments. We learn from the processes by taking greater care to seeing how our plants actually grow and how they respond to our applications of the inputs. We make observations by at least documenting mentally change in how plants grow and how the soil feels in your hands and what it looks like and what diseases come and go, what pest pressure we're facing, what plants fail and succeed. And we make long-term investments by avoiding the shortcuts that many of our modern agricultural practices have taught us in favor of taking the patient path that leads to less and less input over time. And that means we practice regularly applying microorganisms to the soil. We mulch the soil and feed the biology. We do things that sets us up not for each individual season, but we're thinking multiple seasons in advance. And most importantly, like I've said a few times now in this video, we stop thinking of ourselves as the sole benefactors of the garden, and we start viewing ourselves as collaborators within the garden. And I'll conclude this video by pointing out a few of the areas that I think Korean natural farming has to grow and where I want to help you with that. The whole point of KNF is to rely less on external inputs over time and to be more able to produce on-site fertility. It's also to make the procedures and techniques applicable and achievable for every grower everywhere, no matter what part of the world that you're growing in. And I think that if I was to point out a shortcoming of KNF, this would be it. So far, from what I can tell from the broader KNF community, at least on the internet, there's a greater emphasis on sort of dogmatically following the exact protocols and a lesser emphasis on adapting and contextualizing the principles. In other words, KNF, first of all, needs to grow beyond Korea. Currently, it seems like a lot of techniques are best practiced within the geographical region of Korea, and likely a lot of the resources to make the inputs can be grown or sourced there easily. Something I'm hoping to do with gardeners like yourself is to learn what resources, what plants, what geographically specific inputs are available to you. Oriental herbal nutrient, for example, contains ingredients that simply aren't possible to grow in many parts of the world. Are growers in Canada just doomed to import them? Sugar is another thing that is hard to conceive making on-site for most growers. What does it mean to culture IMO in desert climates where forests aren't abundant? Answering these questions and more are a part of the journey that I'm on to work with gardeners to advance the practice. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to hear from many of you via emailing me, telling me about what you're up to and trying out. And so thank you to those of you who have reached out and telling me about it and letting me workshop a bit with you. Jonathan, thanks for sharing some of your collection attempts that you're making in Arizona. I'm really excited to see how things progress with that and what you're trialing. And I think that a lot of folks in Arizona are actually, in the long run, going to be grateful as you work to figure this out. Annette in Australia has been sharing various IMO collection attempts with me, and she's been able to get some really good collections, which I think is a big win for growers in Australia. I know I've corresponded with several other growers in Australia who have really struggled in the past. So it's helpful to walk through a bit of that journey with you, Annette. And many of you might have similar questions that you'd like answered or things that you'd like to workshop with me. So please reach out. You can send me an email to taylor@thegriffin.familyfarm.com, or if you'd like to get a more custom fit, tailor-made counsel, you can sign up for the Natural Gardening Group and we can chat over a video call. Anyway, I hope this was a helpful starter kit for those of you who are dipping your toes in or considering jumping into the KNF pool this growing season. If you do want to dive a bit deeper into indigenous microorganism cultivation, you want to check out this video next. Thanks for watching, and as always, we will see you in the next one.